And welcome everybody. I've been looking forward to this program for a full year because I'm a guy that believes in data, and we have some really interesting data to share with you today about where we've come with buildings and the promise of where we think we can go. Stay tuned. I think we're in for a really great program. I want to start though by saying research like this only happens with support from partners and sponsors, and we're very, very grateful to Carrier Corporation for its sponsorship to help make this research possible. And so I'm thrilled that joining us today to give us a welcome is Mary Milmo from Carrier Corporation. She's Carrier's Vice President for Communications and Marketing. So Mary, let me turn it over to you for a short welcome.
Great, thanks, John. You know, and as the leading global provider of healthy, safe, and sustainable building and cold chain solutions, Carrier is really committed to making the world safer and more sustainable for generations to come. And that includes supporting organizations just like Urban Green, who bring to the building sector and to our local governments actionable data to drive decisions, as you said, John, drive decisions that are based on sound climate science and trusted resources. And addressing climate change means addressing the energy used in buildings. I don't probably have to tell this audience this, but you know, 2/3 of New York City's greenhouse gas emissions come from this sector, from the building sector, which is why the city needs reliable data to provide effective policy to reduce emissions and to track progress. And we're pleased to see that emissions have fallen over the last 10 years. However, there's room to do further and to do more to drive down carbon emissions, particularly through basic energy efficiency retrofits. And so aligned with this, we recognize the opportunity that we have as a building solutions provider to support our customers on their climate journey. That's why Carrier has recently announced our own ambitious goals of reducing our customers' carbon footprint by more than 1 gigaton, which is equivalent to the annual greenhouse gas emissions of Japan. We're going to continue to seek ways to do our part, and with a focus on innovation and technologies that will drive change. And we're proud to sponsor this report as part of our commitment to supporting the body of knowledge, and look forward to the discussion today. So John, I'll toss it back to you to get the party started.
Great, thank you, Mary. So thank you again to Carrier. I also want to give a big shout out to the Mayor's Office of Sustainability for its partnership in helping us bring this report forward. It's been a great project that we've worked on together. So as I said, I'm a firm believer that data drives decisions. And we now have 10 years of data, of benchmarking data in New York City. It's one of the richest data sets in the country. And I'm really, really proud of the Urban Green research team for pouring through this data, for analyzing it and pulling out the trends that we need to know about that are in the report and we're going to cover today. You know, these trends are the markers for how we will get to a zero carbon future. And so I'm excited to start the program, and to do that, I'm going to kick it over to Sean Brennan, who leads the research team at Urban Green and is the lead author of their report. So Sean, let me turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, John. All right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're thrilled to present to you our latest report. It's our third benchmarking report, but the 6th that New York City has done overall. And so we published that back in December. It's called the New York City Energy and Water Use Report. Today I'll be joined by Ross McWhinney from the Mayor's Office. My name is Sean Brennan. I head up the research team here at Urban Green. So let's dive into some of the topics that we'll be talking about today. So first off, what is benchmarking and why do we do it? So I'm sure there are plenty of energy nerds in the audience who know what it is, but it's also important to know why we do it. Secondly, how did New York City's buildings do? So we have a decade of benchmarking data now. So that spans 10 years from 2010 to 2019. So we have a tremendous amount of data that we can study across time now. So we'll do 4 of those different studies. And then finally, I'll touch on some of the new things in this report. For example, mid-size buildings, those started reporting recently. And of course, energy efficiency ratings, those labels you might have noticed recently as well. And then of course, emissions and local law 97. So what is benchmarking? It's pretty straightforward. It's a policy that asks building owners to collect all the energy and water use in the building. Every apartment, every office space, everything gets summed up and then reported at the property level. And so that includes electricity, every kilowatt hour, every therm of gas, and so on. So this is an exercise in awareness that has spread across the country. More than 30 cities, you can see all the little dots that IMT has mapped on the right here, now have some sort of benchmarking program, and it covers about 11 billion square feet. So to give you a sense of how big 11 billion square feet is, that's like 2 New York cities. So the first answer to why we do this is just that it becomes a foundation for data-driven policy. And those policies can have realistic goals. So in New York, the Greener, Greater Buildings Plan set up New York's benchmarking program through Local Law 84. So 2010 was the first year that buildings submitted their data. And at first it was just large buildings, so those over 50,000 square feet. And within the first 3 years, it was actually shown that benchmarking drove a 6% drop in source energy use. So that's actually, it doesn't come from our report. That comes from a fairly rigorous and controlled study you can see in the link below. But it gets to the other reason why we benchmark. Not only can this information be used to develop other climate actions, but it's a climate action in itself. Just by raising awareness within the building, managers, operators, and tenants can make changes. So now, benchmarking in New York City has expanded. It's going down to 25,000 square feet. And coincidentally, there are now about 25,000 properties that reported last year. And that's over 3 billion square feet. So if you recall, the other number was 11 billion square feet. That makes New York City the biggest city that does benchmarking in America. And in fact, that sum is larger than the benchmark area in Los Angeles, Washington, Chicago, Kansas City, and Atlanta combined. So here's one of those first graphs that you'll see about the emissions related to benchmark buildings. So the rectangle represents citywide emissions. So a lot of this data comes from the greenhouse gas inventory. The purple are the emissions from mid-sized and large buildings in 2019. So they account for about half of the building emissions overall, or a little over a third of the citywide emissions. Now, the other buildings are, of course, the small buildings, those under 25,000 square feet, and the light gray are the transportation emissions. Now, putting this into context, it's the first time we could do it, the first time we could assign this proportion to mid-sized and large buildings. It's also really important, though, because a building that's required to benchmark is likely also covered by Local Law 97. So now we get a sense of the potential behind that law. Now, the obvious question to ask next is, are these buildings cutting their emissions fast enough? So let's take a look at how those emissions have changed over time. So this one, you'll see a few different graphs that are going to look across the decade, and that'll always be the x-axis. Here on the y-axis, you're going to see proportional change in energy or emissions. And so the purple here are emissions, the yellow and orange are types of site energy. Now, over the last decade, consistently benchmarked large buildings cut their emissions by 23%. So that's great news. And when I see consistently reported, what I mean is they only missed one of those years out of the last 10. So they reported 9 out of 10 years. Now, that's about 3,000 buildings. So it's a sample, but we really like looking at that cohort to give us some consistency, and it rolls out the noise that might come from new construction, demolition, and reporting inconsistencies. But if you look at the median greenhouse gas intensity across the entire data set for each one of these benchmark years, that emissions drop was also in the 20% range. So the consistently benchmarked set is a fairly good representative sample. So we found three big factors in this 23% decline. Number one is fuel switching, and that was driven by the Clean Heat program, which you're probably familiar with, stopped the permitting of heavy fuel use in 2015. So that's about a quarter of the drop, and I'll go into more detail about that one later. But a lot of those boilers and burners were actually swapped out to use natural gas. The next one is lower energy use. Now, I say lower energy use rather than efficiency because we don't have data on energy efficiency retrofits, but we do have data on the site energy use. So that's the yellow and the orange. And we saw that the energy use dropped by about 8%, which is also great news. And I certainly hope that the majority of that drop is from efficiency projects and not something like occupancy. And the last one, the biggest chunk, of course, is cleaner generation. So this is cleaner electricity and district steam generation. And we used carbon coefficients that came directly from the New York City greenhouse gas inventory to try to give some consistency between those two repositories of data. And so those give us carbon coefficients for electricity and steam. And for example, the carbon coefficient for electricity got 10% cleaner over the last decade. Now, this is just large buildings, and it's only one decade. But the next big question is, are we on track for 80 by 50? So this is very early, extremely early projections to 80 by 50. But what I've modeled here is the large and mid-sized buildings in green, all the way from 2005 to 2050, and then the small buildings in gray. So for the first 5 years, we don't really know much. From 2005 to 2010, small buildings, large and mid-size in the model all do the same thing. After 2010, so over that decade, large buildings accelerate, and that's based on the benchmark data. So they were able to cut about 2.3% of their emissions year over year, and that is really getting them close to the small building emissions. In fact, today, they're a little bit larger than small building emissions, but we expect that in the next 5 to 10 years, that could actually flip-flop. So it's really encouraging news for benchmark buildings. And that decline is slowing, but they're still on track to hit 40 by 30, in fact. So it's expected that the rate of decline would slow. It's kind of like training for a race. The first minute you shave off of your mile time is always going to be the easiest, and you get there the fastest. The last minute you shave off your time is going to be the hardest. But new policies like Local Law 97 and of course cold weather heat pumps could give us the acceleration we need to get large and mid-sized buildings to that 80 by 50 target. So this is again a look at how a policy worked out over time. This time, the buildings are broken into 3 different eras. And this is all about energy code. And so you can think of energy code arriving in the year 2012. And that's the era all the way on the right. So in the benchmark data set, we have about 900 properties that were built after 2012. And then in the middle, we have what we call modern properties. And that's almost 3,000 buildings that were built between 1980 and 2011. And then on the far left, you'll see the pre-war and the post-war buildings. So this is all about fuel use intensity. And what we see for multifamily and hotel properties are the fuel use intensities dropping over time. So that is partially attributable to technology, new systems, better systems, retrofits, new construction. And that's kind of what you see in the modern declines. But when it prevails over to the next era, we really feel that energy code probably played a pretty big role here. And the new multifamilies, those built in the last 7 or 8 years, use 57% less fuel per square foot than the pre and post-war multifamily buildings. So great news and really encouraging for energy code as well. The next one, circling back to the Clean Heat program. it looks like our large buildings have made a huge shift to gas over the last decade. It is now the largest energy source in the benchmark set. So the Clean Heat program cut heavy fuel use by 99%, and just 89 properties are still using it in the midsize and large category. Most of those buildings, I think 2/3 or 3/4, are located in the Bronx and Manhattan. So natural gas use has nearly doubled over the last. Actually, electricity use has fallen, and a lot of that I would attribute to the efficiency and the drops in site energy that we saw. So that was the decade of data. And now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the new things that are in this report. So mid-size buildings are those between 25,000 and 50,000 square feet. They started to report their energy use from 2017. So we now have 3 years of data for them. And I got to say the data quality has really improved over those last 3 years. They now are hitting an 85% compliance rate. So we have almost 10,000 mid-sized properties that reported last year. And of course, not a big surprise, most of those 3/4 were multifamily buildings. You can see a nice example of a mixed residential and commercial use building on the right there. That's 150 Wooster. A great example of a building that was not benchmarking before, but now does. And in general, what we found with these buildings are that they tend to be older, a little bit denser in terms of how many people use them. And potentially, as an outcome of that, they use more water per square foot. So let's look at that water use a little bit more closely. So mid-sized buildings tend to be more water intensive. And you can see that the top row of circles is all mid-sized buildings. So colleges, offices, schools, multifamily, and hotels. The bottom circles are all large buildings. And so the shift to the right from the bottom to top shows you that as you move from large to mid-size, they all get more water intensive. Now, some of those building sectors also have data associated with occupants, like multifamily buildings. And so we saw that the mid-sized buildings tend to have more bedrooms and apartments packed into those buildings. Now, the energy results, as you can see in the report, don't correlate quite as strongly, and so they vary sector by sector. Another new element in New York City, as well as our report, are the building energy efficiency ratings. So these labels, which are grades A, B, C, D, went up in lobbies in October, and they're based on Energy Star scores from 2019. So offices, you can see in green, did really well. Half of them earned A's and B's. Multifamily buildings have some work to do. About 70% of them got C's and D's. But in general, we found that the higher letter grades corresponded with lower carbon emissions. So that even though the energy labeling law is not directly associated with the building emissions law, they do correlate. So that's the final piece, is checking in on Local Law 97 and how much work we have to do over the next 3 or 4 years. So you'll see in the graph, this is a histogram of emission intensities from offices. So offices, just like in their building energy labels, are doing fairly well in terms of their emissions. For the 2024 carbon cap, just 11% of office properties will have to do something to get under that cap. Multifamilies and hotels, you can see their distribution in the report, hover around 20% of the properties that will have to do something. And interestingly, there was a water intensity difference, but there's also an emission intensity difference with mid-sized buildings. And so if you look at just the mid-sized buildings within a sector, it's closer to 30% of those properties will have to do something to get under their 2024 cap. So just like the 80 by 50 projection, it's pretty early to start talking about carbon limits with Local Law 97. A lot of energy efficiency could happen between now and then. And we certainly hope that that happens. Thank you very much. And I'm going to pass it over to my friend and colleague, Ross McWhinney from the New York City Mayor's Office. We're very happy to have worked with him, and it's been a great collaborative project. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. Just let me try to share the screen here. Can you see my front page? Okay, yeah, so thanks, Sean, for walking us through that. That was all, I think, really pretty interesting. My name, again, is Ross McWhinney. I'm a senior advisor working in the Mayor's Office of Sustainability for about 6 years now. Our office works in service of New Yorkers and our collective future. And in the office, I work on using data to support policy and program development. And I also manage the city's greenhouse gas inventory. So I'm going to talk a little bit about basics of the inventory, some of the more recent findings, and then some improvements we've made to the process. So New York City has been publishing and updating citywide inventories since 2007, and our reporting base year is 2005. We're actually required by local law 22 of 2008 to continue to generate these reports and continue to update the inventory, which is basically a fundamental tool to identify where emissions are coming from and to track our progress in reducing emissions. The sources included in the inventory, stationary energy, which includes buildings, as well as other stationary sources, and fugitive emissions from the natural gas distribution system inside the city. Transportation, which includes on-road transport, railways, marine navigation, and a small amount of aviation that occurs entirely within city limits. And then waste, which includes wastewater and solid waste generated within the city. And we report and compile this inventory under the GPC, which is a standard developed by WRI and ICLEI, which many cities report under globally. So looking at the 2019 inventory, shows a 15% reduction in citywide emissions since our 2005 base year. I think everybody here is pretty aware, but stationary energy, or rather buildings, is the largest source by far, accounting for 68% of citywide emissions, transportation accounting for 28%, and waste for 4%. And then another view here is to look at emissions by fuel, kind of fuel source. And there's 3 things to highlight here, and they actually are very similar to things that Sean identified. One milestone, though, is that in 2019 was the first year where heating oil vendors reported no number 6 fuel oil sales to us. So there's clearly a little bit of number 6 in the benchmarking data, so slight divergence there, but I think it's still a point where we're seeing that number 6 is nearly or almost entirely gone from the building sector. And then you also see here this big growth in natural gas consumption, which coincides with that reduction in number 6, and to some degree, a reduction in number 4 fuel oil. And so we think that that's driven to a large degree by the city's local law 43 of 2010, which phases out number 6 by 2015, and other factors as well. And then also there's the reduction in emissions from electricity. Sean identified that that's due largely to efficiency, more kind of increased, a reduced consumption of electricity, but we believe it's also driven by the adoption of more efficient gas-fired combined cycle plants, kind of in Zone J and other areas of New York State. And so in 2019 and in 2020, our office worked to improve our process on the inventory, and there are kind of 2 key ways that we did that. The first was an overhaul of how we calculated emissions from our electricity that supplies New York City. So New York City generates its own electricity emissions factor instead of using the EPA's E-grid factor, which is, I think, the more common method. This allows us to consider the impacts of imported power to New York City from outside of the 5 boroughs. And it gives us a factor each year, right? So eGrid is, I think, on a 2-year cycle. And so we've had this method in place, but we knew it needed to be improved. So we worked with PowerGem, a consultant who's an expert in electricity markets modeling, to reassess how much we weighted the electricity coming from different zones outside of New York City. So New York City consumes more electricity than is generated in our area, and we needed to assess based on constraints in the transmission system, transmission lines, and just distance, how we weighted different parts of the state. So that was a major part of the work. We also reviewed and improved errors in some of the data, kind of minor things, but did a QA process along the way. We also stopped the practice of assuming that all contracted power reached New York City, regardless of where it was located. That was kind of an artifact of an earlier approach. And so now, for instance, we consider energy coming from Indian Point, or did, the same way we would consider other resources in that area, rather than considering it 100% just because there's a contract for that electricity. And then finally, we included older, dirtier resources that were not originally considered in the baseline because the data wasn't available. So this includes power plants that use tire-derived fuels, waste oil, municipal solid waste, petroleum coke, pretty rare, but quite dirty resources. So all of that, we think, gave us a much more reliable electricity emission factor. And so that was the major drive. And then we also took a big effort to work with city agencies, so Department of Consumer Affairs and the Department of Environmental Protection. We worked with Consumer Affairs to build out the list of heating oil vendors that we require, that we collect data from each year. So much kind of better coverage of who we're collecting that data from. And then this year, or rather in 2019, for the first time, we actually issued penalties to vendors who were not submitting data. They're compelled to do so under Local Law 43 of, I don't remember, I think it's 2010. And so between those two measures, we think we reached a much better coverage of vendors and also better compliance, better data submission from those groups. And so those are the main improvements to the inventory. That does it for me. And thanks for listening.
Okay, thank you, Ross. Appreciate that. So just a reminder, we're going to move into the Q&A session here. Please use the Q&A box to enter your questions, and you can upvote your fellow audience participants for a question you might like. So Sean, if you could join us back, we can get going with the questions. There you are. Ross, you almost had to answer all the questions. All right, let's get right into it. Okay, first question here is about schools. Are schools involved in benchmarking? This person wants to assist their school with benchmarking. They're an eco-educator. What access would they need, permissions, as portfolio manager use? So anybody want to comment on how schools fall into this?
Sure. Well, so I guess the first thing to say is that anybody can benchmark their building. It's not limited to areas that have compliance or laws in place requiring benchmarking. You could benchmark your home. I guess the other thing I would say is that the Department of Citywide Administrative Services in New York City already benchmarks, I believe it's all properties down to 5,000 square feet. So they're going to be capturing basically every public, school, every DOE school. Now, if you're talking about a private school, then I guess that would be probably a discussion with, the people who manage that school. What you need to access is basically, just as Sean said, all of the energy and water data. We worked over the years with Con Ed and National Grid, as well as with DEP, to build automatic uploads of data to Portfolio Manager. So you might need to connect with those utilities to get those data flows established, but the process should, it's well worn and ready for you to make those requests.
Okay, great. Next question here, has any data been collected to compare commercial office tenants and their energy use by specific industry sectors? The question goes on to say tenant consumption accounts for 70-75% of commercial building without individual industry benchmarks. A law firm, for example, is not aware of how their energy use compares to other law firms. So how can we, what's the best way to address that?
So I can take the first crack at this. We actually just had an event called the Great Energy Disconnect on this type of issue. The benchmarking data does not split out the tenant energy use versus the base building energy use. So we weren't able to answer that question in this report, but it is, a great question that needs answered. And there are some interesting technology providers out there that are starting to do that. To collaborate with them to get some of that data and determine, the kind of proportions that were in the question and figure out how much of the emissions decline can come from the base building versus tenant changing their behavior.
Okay, thank you. Next question. How much of the multifamily building property energy decrease is due to tenants as opposed to property upgrades?
So, there wasn't a huge decrease in the multifamily sector. But again, we don't know how much is from the tenants versus the base building. But can I share my screen one more time?
Yes.
Here we go. So this is from the report. And what you'll see in figure 9 in the report is a comparison between multifamily, office, public schools, and hotels between their weather normalized source EY and site over time. And so you can see for multifamilies, there's not a huge change for site or for source, certainly not as big as the office change. Now, of course, the offices benefit from using a lot of electricity. And like Ross was speaking to, electricity's gotten a lot cleaner. But yeah, the multifamily sector has not shifted much. It's just in the last couple of years that they really have turned a corner.
Okay. Next question. Benchmarking and the New York City greenhouse gas inventory, both deep dive data reports. What are the top 3 takeaways?
I would say from the benchmarking report, it's that we have seen really encouraging results from the large buildings. And it certainly looks like the policies that have been enacted over the last decade, benchmarking, auditing, the clean heat program, have done their job. And so as those policies expand into the mid-sized sector, I'm pretty hopeful that we're going to see some of the same declines there. And then I'm also hopeful about the future for large buildings and the new policies that have been enacted.
And so for the inventory, I'd say that probably the biggest takeaway was an early one, which was the impact of the building sector. And then partnered with a little more analysis was the impact of the large buildings, which is where the Greater Greener Building Plan came from originally, including the benchmarking law, and motivated basically all of the work that led to Local Law 97. So I'd say that's the most fundamental. But in recent years, I mean, as we've seen a trend over time, the impact of more efficient gas-fired generation for electricity has been a clear trend that's we've recognized, and that has, in a sense, been kind of fruit that's been kind of plucked already. And I think now we're seeing impacts of weather driving emissions year to year. And so we think that actually the work is, the hard work is what's in front of us. And not only have the easier things been done, not that that's entirely easy, but that the weather may be, we expect it to get more volatile. And so we're going to have to do more in the face of a greater challenge.
Okay, next question. Are there plans to benchmark buildings under 25,000 square feet? And would this be an effective policy to address emissions in this sector?
There really haven't been any formal or even not that many conversations at all about this. I think improved data access would improve policymaking most certainly, but it's not clear that benchmarking is the ideal way to get there. Also, when we talk about going down in square footage, you're going to get diminishing returns in coverage in terms of emissions, right? Smaller buildings emit fewer emissions. So it hasn't been a formal discussion, but those are at least some thoughts on the topic.
And I'll just add that as you lower that threshold, you get many, many more properties. We were talking about mid-size and large, there's tens of thousands of buildings and properties. But if you go all the way down to, say, a single family home, you're talking about over 1 million buildings. So the logistics of that are really challenging.
Okay, how did the updates to the calculation methodology change the electricity emissions factor in New York City? What is the latest factor?
Oh, I don't remember the factor off the top of my head, sorry. But it actually drove emissions up in all years to some degree. And so including the base year and then years in the interim. I'd say that if I remember correctly, there was a 3% percentage point change in the emissions factor. But I don't think it had an impact that, dwarfed that of, improved efficiency in electricity generation. It didn't change the overall trends. It kind of just set total emissions up a bit higher.
Okay, thanks, Ross. Here's a question in my own background, Sean. Are you considering including emissions from refrigerants, hydrofluorocarbons, particularly from commercial properties in future benchmarking years? How about, let's start with, what do we think the proportion of refrigerants are in the city's greenhouse gas emissions? Do we even track them that way?
No, I mean, there isn't an option for tracking through Portfolio Manager of HFCs. I think that the state has been working with California actually for a while, who kind of developed a good HFC tracking method. And so we've been in contact with the state to understand how we might apply that to the inventory, but it's still kind of a conversation in process. I think that I would say New York State kind of has been getting a handle on it over the last year or two. And so it's probably on us to start understanding if we can bring that to the inventory, but benchmarking is not a data source for that.
And I'll just say, if you look at the EPA's data on fugitive methane versus refrigerant leaks, methane is still dwarfing refrigerant leaks in terms of their global warming potential. So you're asking to get down to a finer level of granularity that, like Ross was saying, might have diminishing returns. But we also don't have great data on refrigerant leaks in general. That's one of those things we've been searching for to answer that question, especially for heat pumps.
I think it would be certainly like a modeled outcome. You wouldn't have the sort of like very granular activity data that you have from benchmarking or that we enjoy from the utilities for the inventory. It would certainly be a modeled output.
Well, it's a measurement issue, right? I mean, it's easier to measure energy than refrigerant leaks, just for sensors and other reasons. But on to the next question. What was the most surprising data you uncovered? So I'll let both of you tell me what your biggest surprise was.
I'll go first. I think the biggest surprise actually came from the energy code, and that was one that Ross and his team suggested we investigate. And so when I was looking at that and breaking it into different eras, I really expected that it's too short a time period. There's too few buildings. We're not going to see anything. And lo and behold, it was a huge drop, and for the most unlikely of sectors, the multifamily sector. So that was a really welcomed surprise.
Yeah, I mean, the inventory, I guess the thing that surprised me was, the impact of heating and cooling degree days from 2017 to 2018. 17 was a mild year, low in emissions, and the impact of increased cooling and heating degree days drove not just increased consumption, but drove different methods of electricity generation, particularly in the winter when the power plants had to convert off of gas to oil because there was such high gas demand in buildings. So that shift, even though it only occurred for a handful of days, had a pretty significant impact on building-based emissions.
Okay, next question. We've seen great savings in energy. What about water?
So we did not look at that in great detail, but that's a great suggestion, I think, from Herschel. So that's something we should take a look at. But I will mention that, that data is still becoming more consistent. In fact, 2019 was the first year that schools really reported their water use. And so that made a huge difference and really drove up the overall water use. So I think we need to come up with a methodology for dealing with some of those inconsistencies, but it's a great point, and we should be looking at water over time too.
Great. Next question, maybe I'll take to let you guys off the hook. It says, any new policies planned on horizon that mayoral candidates should get behind? Urban Green has been active with meeting with mayoral candidates to offer ourselves as a resource and to answer questions about the future. Clearly, with Local Law 97, we're just starting to implement it. We have like the guideposts of it in the law, but the actual nuts and bolts on how this is going to work is being played out real time by the advisory board and the working groups to which we are active on both. And so it's the successful implementation of the law to make sure that the Department of Buildings is appropriately funded to implement the law, which, with competing priorities and tough budget years, that's always a big issue. And to look at ways that we can continually, creatively implement the law to ensure compliance. One of those big areas is no surprises. Urban Green is working on building carbon trading as a breakthrough policy to get to carbon reductions in this sector. So that's one area that we're asking candidates to look at. Next question, Sean, you showed a chart comparing fuel use over 3 vintage building types. Did you to see the significant savings from the stricter codes? Did you look at or see similar reductions for electricity use?
Good question. Thank you, Dick. We did look at that. We didn't see the same trend. So I just shared my screen to look at, again, that figure, but in the report, we have one that tracks electricity use as well. So between the modern era and the energy code era, really not much difference at all. But then between the newer buildings and the pre and post-war, we did see more electricity use. I don't think that's driven by code. I don't think that's driven by systems not being as efficient. It's just that we're using more electricity to do more things in our buildings. So that's pretty much what we saw. Unfortunate that there wasn't a decline there, but not that surprising either.
Okay, here's the next question about the credibility of the data. So are there plans to have audits of benchmarking submissions for quality, or to require credentialed companies to be submitting the reports?
That's an approach I think Chicago pursued, and we'd considered in earlier years. What we've done in around data quality, one thing is that the Department of Buildings started issuing kind of notices and warnings and possibly even violations around really basic data quality issues for people who were submitting in advance of the reporting deadline. And we think that's had an impact. The other major thing we did was this development of automatic uploads of utility data. So, that we believe takes the user error out of the potential for user error out of the picture to a pretty large degree, the data coming straight from Grid or Con Ed. So I think that we have not been discussing an audit, at least not an individual building level audit. It is a feature of Local Law 97 where there are more significant penalties, where there are penalties associated with emissions performance. But I don't foresee that being a part of the benchmarking law, at least not so far.
Okay, thanks. Next question here. Is Local Law 84 data available beyond 2017?
Absolutely. And that's, posted by, but we also have it on our report landing page. And if you grab it from our report landing page, you'll actually also get our cleaning methodology. So you'll see all the flags that are there that show you which properties we think are duplicates and which properties we think did not submit valid energy use data. So definitely check that out. And that's another way that we help to verify the quality of the data before we start analyzing it.
So Sean, you froze there for just a second. So the second part of your question answer was check our website, but the first part you froze at on where to find.
Okay. So, that data is publicly available from the city. It's also available from us. And that's all the way back to 2010. And you can find that with ours or with the cities. But if you grab it from ours, you'll get the data cleaning flags too.
Great.
I'll just offer, the data cleaning flag sounds like a very interesting tool. But if you want to get it from the city's resource, it's NYC open data. And you'll just want to search for a local ID for would be a good keyword.
Okay. Here's an interesting question. Has green infrastructure on or around buildings played any significant role in energy and water numbers or reductions or data?
Well, not significant. And in terms of green infrastructure, I assume you mean like a green roof or maybe solar panels on the roof. And not a lot of solar generation is reported in the benchmark data yet. I've seen those numbers grow, but they're still trivial. And then there isn't a way to capture kind of water retention yet. But again, that would be interesting.
Okay. Next question. How's multifamily defined? With that, in New York City, Manhattan, we are co-op and condo oriented.
Absolutely. So all of the co-ops, all of the condos, all of the market rate rentals, all of the reg rentals are going to be multifamily. Those are categorized in Portfolio Manager, the tool that enables benchmarking. And so they all get categorized in the same way, which is multifamily. And if you want more detail on if it's a certain type of multifamily, then the Pluto database from the Department of Planning is where you would go.
Okay, next question. At some point, will we be focusing more on reporting carbon than energy?
Well, from the benchmarking point of view, absolutely. That's kind of a shift we made in this report. So certainly.
And then in Local Law 97, it's already carbon is the focus, though the tools for reporting probably we think will be similar to benchmarking.
Okay, next question is about sharing with other cities. Is New York City helping other cities have the same robust data and great analysis? Seems like all cities should be doing this.
Well, so over the years, we've been a part of several networks. Institute for Market Transformation was a really great partner in spreading the approach of benchmarking and even energy audit policies to many cities across the country. And that map that Sean shared kind of shows the product of that work. I guess NRDC was also a big partner there through the City Energy Project. And so I don't think we can claim all the credit at all, but we've tried to support them in that work with kind of lessons learned, best practices. We've also worked through the Department of Energy and the EPA to improve Portfolio Manager as a tool, to think about other tools that would help cities with their benchmarking and energy audit laws.
Okay. Next question. If electricity is the cleanest source of energy, how is New York City encouraging more conversions?
Well, I think it's still kind of being determined. I mean, one aspect of this is local law 97, but there are some difficult questions that still need to be answered about when the grid will get much cleaner. I think that it's still not entirely clear that converting to electrification today will save every building greenhouse gas emissions. And so people are looking at states' commitments around greening the grid statewide and locally. And really, I think it's a question of timing. When will be that inflection point, and when will we know? When will we be able to plan for it? So there's quite a lot of kind of, I guess, questions being asked around that issue. And I'm sorry, I can't give an easy answer on that.
Hey, Sean, maybe in 30 seconds, can you summarize going electric and the research you have on tap for this year?
Absolutely. So we're looking into that. I mean, electricity might be the cleanest source of energy, but it all depends how you use it. And so we're advocating for air source heat pumps, cold climate air source heat pumps that are efficient enough to replace natural gas boilers, fuel oil boilers, especially in multifamily buildings. And that was what going electric looked at, was why these conversions are not yet happening and what we have to do to get there. The next piece of the electrification research will be all about, if these buildings do start to electrify, what's the impact on power demand across the city? And then how can we make sure that we do it in a logical way and take into account things like demand response and distributed energy resources.
Great. Okay, got time for a few more questions here. Do you see any pockets of fuel oil use in the city? What can we do to eliminate remaining fuel oil use, especially number 4?
Yeah, that's an important one. And we touch on this in the report. So those buildings that still use any amount of heavy fuel oil, that might be 4, 5, or 6, are concentrated in the Bronx and northern Manhattan. And so there's a Columbia study that we cited in the report that does a lot of great detail on that. And I think part of the way you get there is just to emphasize the health impacts of burning fuel oil, especially in a city, and then talk about the conversions that are possible for those buildings, and hopefully even leapfrog over a natural gas boiler to something that's electric.
I would just add, the benchmarking data set is so rich and with great detail, but it has that limitation that it only applies to buildings over 25,000 square feet. So for the inventory, we collect heating oil data on a zip code level, and we're actually in the process of trying to compile that in a way that would allow us to assess consumption on a zip code basis. So I think it's a really interesting question, and we're kind of in the process of analyzing it.
Here's another good question regarding the greenhouse gas inventory. How are waste emissions calculated? Does it calculate methane from landfills and the amount we're sending to landfills? Does it calculate the amount of organics in our waste to create methane? Somebody asked me yesterday, does it include food waste? But what's in that 4%?
Yeah, no, I mean, all of those things are included. I mean, one feature in New York City is that all of our landfills are closed within the 5 boroughs. So that waste is all being exported. But the emissions are kind of, I'd say, to a degree modeled. So the amount of waste that's collected is our activity data. So it is the methane from landfills. The food waste is a consideration. And it's interesting, some of that actually makes it into the wastewater treatment plant at Newtown Creek with the big digester egg. So we have kind of composting as an emission source, but also we have to account for the amount of it that goes into that digester.
Hey, Ross, do you break it out? Do you know how, of the 4%, how much actually is food waste?
It's pretty small. I don't have the exact number, but it's not a big component.
Got it. Oh, another question here. How many properties are currently required to report, and how many properties reported 9 out of the 10 years required to make the analysis list?
So, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, this is about compliance, I believe, compliance rates. And actually, Sean, I guess you spoke to it, but we've seen compliance even, so before the 25,000 square foot buildings came in the low 90s, 93 range. I think, Sean, you said that the compliance you observed kind of grew since 2017. So yeah, maybe you have more to add.
Yeah, I mean, the number of properties required to benchmark is tough to pin down. I know you guys put out a covered buildings list every year, but we estimate that like 30,000 properties and then more buildings than that are required to benchmark. And I think there was also a piece about which ones consistently benchmark. So that was over 3,100 had reported consistently over the 10 years, and those are large benchmark buildings. So those are the buildings and are avoiding kind of violations and so on.
Okay, and this will probably be our last question. I dug deep in the hat. I'm an architect and I do work on energy efficiency retrofits. Which sectors should I focus my efforts on?
Well, maybe that's a question of what moves you. You could take a focus that had kind of a equity and environmental justice consideration. There you'd be working, I guess, mainly in multifamily or smaller residential buildings. Perhaps, technology is very interesting to you. And so often a lot of large commercial buildings are doing things like sub-metering and considering real-time emissions and things like that. So you'd have to kind of ask what are kind of your areas of interest, but those are 2 suggestions.
I would echo that. Certainly do what you love, but the mid-size multifamily sector, so the residential buildings between 25 and 50,000 square feet, really need help. And we've seen that their emissions are the highest among all the sectors right now. So they definitely could use your skills.
Okay, well, let's wrap it there. I want to thank Ross McWhinney from the Mayor's Office of Sustainability for not only being on the program today, but also for the great partnership this past year on the report. Thank you, Ross. Thank you, Sean, for a great presentation today. I want to thank Carrier Corporation again, whose sponsorship helped underwrite the research in this area. I want to thank all of you. We had tremendous questions. We couldn't get to all of them. That's a sign of a good program, but feel free to engage with us and contact us as you learn more about the report.